is about the way that discourse creates organisation. So I'm looking at how people interact with each other in order to create organisations which seem to be very solid and have a material basis, but which actually I'm showing in my research is all based on human interaction. Well, of course, you have to do a lot of reading, but I decided at the beginning that I was going to go into the basics of the subject. So I dug a little deeper than just the business literature, and I looked at the sociological and philosophical underpinnings in order to get a clear idea of what I wanted to do. I didn't want to do just what everybody else had done before, and I felt that it was important to do something original, for my own sake, as much as for the requirements of the degree. What you tend to find is that a journal article is of a limited length, and therefore, even if it's a conceptual article, it can't have a huge range or depth to it. In fact, to be able to do that, you need to write a book, and writing books seems to have gone out of fashion in the academic world because of the way that business schools are funded. They get much greater credit for writing journal articles. Well, both. Because of the nature of what I'm looking at, I read a lot of conceptual articles. But of course, the concept isn't of any value unless it can be applied. So there is, of course, along with that, quite a lot of application of ideas in empirical research, which is, of course, very important. The limitation, I feel, is that sometimes the ideas are not simple ones, are quite complex. And to explore them through empirical research requires quite a lot of space, which I feel is not given in a journal article very often. Oh yes, absolutely. I think that's very important. A theory isn't of any use unless you can apply it, and I think it has to be very clear what its practical use is. And I don't think a theory is a good theory unless it can be applied. However, I do think as well that it's important to develop theory to the depth that is required, and not just for the depth that's required to produce a paper. So what I intend to do is to develop a theoretical framework which can then be applied in many different contexts. So what I would like to do is to develop the theory early on, and then produce papers that show how it's applied in these different contexts. Well, that's very difficult to say, because I think that doing a PhD is a very personal thing. It is, after all, an apprentice piece. And people start from different points, they have different experiences as they go along. I think that a general pattern that I've seen is that people spend longer than they expected to define what it is that they want to actually look into. Often they start by being over-ambitious, and then they have to narrow it down and narrow it down and narrow it down. But also, I think that they often make the mistake of not thinking early enough in the process about how they're going to gather the data. It's all very well having a project that you want to do, but if you can't gather the data for it for some practical reason, then you end up having to rethink the whole thing. I think that doing a PhD is a recursive process. It isn't a step-by-step process. You can't say you do A, then B, then C, then D. In fact, you've got to go round that loop several times in order to produce something that's worthwhile. Well, I think that one of the main reasons for doing a PhD full time, rather than trying to do it from home, as it were, and doing it part time, perhaps mixing it with a job. And the advantages of that is that you have contact with other PhD students and members of staff. And I think it's that dialogue that is very stimulating and helps you to explore ideas, learn new things, and try out what your own thoughts are. It's that sense of academic community I think is very important. Well, I think that there is a kind of tradition in British academia, in contrast, for example, to the American system, of leaving PhD students to their own devices, with the expectation that they're going to sit on their own, read a lot of things, and eventually out comes a PhD thesis. I think that there's a lot of things that can be shared that are common skills that PhD students need to learn early on, to do with research, to do with writing as well. And these things really need to be taught. I'm not saying that a huge amount of the PhD should be taught, and perhaps the Americans go too far in that direction. But I do think that there are some input, some courses that are useful for everyone. Well, I think that writing is particularly important. I think that writing is a skill which is difficult to acquire, and many students are, they may be quite competent, but many are not competent enough in writing academic English to produce journal articles, for example, which they are expected to do, or to produce a thesis itself, and that gives them a lot of difficulty and sleepless nights. So I think making sure that everybody's got a good competence in writing academic English and giving them the support for that is important. I also think that just learning basic techniques about literature searches and how to produce a literature review is also useful. And also techniques for gathering data and analysing data. I've noticed among PhD students very often that they don't think hard enough about their audience when they're designing either interview questions or questionnaire questions. They think about it in terms of the academic terminology, rather than adjusting it to the people that they're actually trying to get the information from. That sort of thing, I think, is very important to make people aware of. I think that, I suppose my basic feeling about that is that in order to successfully complete a PhD, you have to really want to do a PhD. You shouldn't see it instrumentally as a means to an end. I think that if you do, then you're quite likely to find it hard and possibly demoralising, because it is a difficult process to go through. But if you have something that you're passionately interested in, which you want to look at for its own sake, and you can find a university that has a congenial atmosphere, and a supervisor who you can work with. I think that combination is essential.